Hello, my name's Susie Johns, and this is lesson 9 in my Learn to Draw series. Learn to Draw is a series of 11 lessons designed for people who are just beginning to learn to draw. They may have stopped drawing when they were younger because they didn't think they were very good, or it might be that people have tried drawing and just want some tips and techniques to help them to improve. So in lesson 8 we used coloured pencils, and I'm going to take it a step further than that by introducing water-soluble or watercolour pencils. So I'm going to show you some watercolour pencils so that you understand what we're using. I'm going to recommend some paper and some other tools that we will use, and then we'll try some techniques with watercolour pencils, some little sort of tricks and tips that I can share with you, and then we'll embark on a project using watercolour pencils so that you can practice the techniques.
There are lots of different brands of watercolour pencil to choose from. The way you tell it's a watercolour pencil, by the way, is it will have a picture of a paintbrush on it, or it might just say the word watercolour. If you're new to watercolour, you don't have to go out and spend a lot of money on a whole set of pencils. All the best quality watercolour pencils seem to be available individually, and it means that you can try them without committing yourself to a major purchase and spending too much money and then finding you don't really get on well with that particular brand. So the pencil I just used was a Caran d'Ache Prismalo pencil, and this one is made by Derwent and it's called Inktense. I'm going to show you 6 different coloured pencils just to do a little brand comparison, and I'm just making a small swatch of each one. Watercolour pencils are available in 3 basic grades, and some of the manufacturers offer all 3 grades. The lower grade being a student pencil, the middle grade a studio pencil, and the top grade artist's quality. And I would always recommend that you buy the best you can afford. Now I'm getting a small pot of water and a paintbrush, and we're going to look at how the coloured pencil transforms into paint with just the application of some water. I would say that a small watercolour brush is ideal for this, and don't get it too wet, don't use too much water, just a damp brush is all you need. I'd be happy to recommend any of the 6 brands that I've shown you here, and just as a rough guide to price, the one at the top, the Caran d'Ache, would be the most expensive, and the one at the bottom would be the cheapest of the 6. If you do decide to buy a whole set of watercolour pencils, I think it's a great idea to make a colour chart swatching all the different colours, and then you can keep that in your tin as a reference. So on a piece of watercolour paper I have drawn a grid of 24 strips, and I'm going to write the numbers of the various pencils. And when that's done, I'll colour in each of the 24 strips with the coloured pencils, going from dark at one end to light. This isn't really apparent with the first colour, which is white, but you'll soon see what I mean. Now, as well as your watercolour pencils, you're going to find a few other little tools quite handy, I think. I'll just run through those. So there's your watercolour pencils, a paintbrush, pencil, a pen, and then a scalpel and some small containers for pigment. Earlier we looked at drawing with the watercolour pencils, then brushing them with water to transform the pencil marks into paint. There are other ways of using your pencils. For example, you can create a little watercolour palette by making some quite heavy pencil marks on a sheet of paper. You can use these as your palette, and then all you need is a damp brush to activate the colour, and then you can paint with it just like using watercolours. In fact, you could use this idea when you're out sketching. Prepare your sketchbook by drawing some little swatches of watercolour pencil on a page. Then if you have one of these brushes that has a little reservoir for water, you can use that to activate the paint. That way, all you need to put in your bag is your sketchbook, one of those brushes, a pencil. Then you're all set. Of course, you can use the pencils themselves as a source of colour. You, again, use a damp brush and stroke it on the tip of the pencil to pick up the colour. Then paint with the pigment that's on the brush. The techniques so far have been on dry paper, but if you get a wet brush and brush the paper to wet it first, you can then apply the watercolour pencils onto the wet paper. You can do this in a direct way by simply drawing with the pencil onto the damp paper and vary the pressure to get a different intensity of colour, and then you can use a brush for blending. Or if you take a knife blade, and use it to scrape off the colour from the tip of the pencil, you can scrape it directly onto the damp paper for some really interesting effect. The little pieces of pigment disperse into the water and create a sort of lovely speckled effect. You can add as many colours as you like, and you can play around with it by smudging it with your finger, or maybe using a paintbrush to to spread the paint out a little. If you like the effect that this powdered pigment gives you, then you can prepare some in advance. If you take a craft knife and scrape the pigment onto a dry piece of paper, you can then transfer that powder into a little pot ready for when you want to use it. We've seen how it works on damp paper, but you can also put it onto dry paper. I've got watercolour paper here, and I'm just sprinkling a little of the pigment onto the dry paper. Then I'm going to get water spray. You can just put some water in a spray bottle. I've got an aerosol, and spray the area to activate the pigment. If you want to disperse the colour, I like to use the wrong end of my paintbrush and just push the colour around. I'm going to include one last tip before we embark on a project, and this is because so many of my students seem eager to dip their watercolour pencils directly into the water. Wetting the tip of the pencil can produce more intense colour. However, I would exercise caution when doing it because you do not want the wooden part of the pencil to get wet. So if you're going to do it, just put the very, very tip of the pencil into the water. So let's start a project now. I thought it might be nice to do some flowers. I don't often paint flowers. I do a lot of embroidery and I love to embroider flowers. So I thought pansies might be a nice subject. I've got some watercolour paper here and a set of pencils. There's 24 pencils, but I've got more in this make. So I'm going to add a few extra purples and blues and another yellow. I'll start by sketching out the outline of the flowers. If you'd like to use this yourself, you'll find a copy of this outline on my website, and you'll find the details in the description below. So there you have it, a little motif of colourful pansies done with watercolour pencils. And I do hope you picked up some useful tips and techniques about using watercolour pencils. And I do hope you'll join me for the next in the series of Learn to Draw, which is all about pen and ink. Thank you.